I'm Guy Hubbs, archivist for the North Alabama Conference, and today I have William E. Nicholas, who has just published Go and Be Reconciled, Alabama Methodists Confront Racial Injustice, 1954 to 1974. Bill, how'd you get started on this thing?
I think it was actually a conversation with Dr. Louise Branson, who was very well known in Methodist circles in Alabama. Certainly was one of the most important lay leaders in the state. And she talked about the upheaval that had gone on during the 1950s and 60s concerning the merger of the conference, of the Central Conference, which was the all-black conference, with the North Alabama and the West Florida. Alabama West Florida conferences, and how that had been a really important period in the history of the church. And I asked her if there were any print sources on it, and she said, well, I'm sure there would be material in the archives right down the street. And so from that point on, I think I just began to explore, and I was happy to find that we had the collection of papers of the bishops who had served in the North Alabama Conference. We had the journals, we had everything you would need to work on the history of the North Alabama Conference. And this topic was one that I related to because I had already done a good deal of work in my teaching on the American Civil Rights Movement. I am not a Southern historian, so I was seeing the civil rights movement from the national point of view. But of course, living in Birmingham, you can hardly escape the fact that some of the most important and pivotal events of the movement took place in Birmingham and elsewhere in Alabama. And that story is contemporaneous with the story of merger within the church.
Well, as archivist for the conference, I know that those written sources tell you a lot, but they don't really get to the real story.
No, they're quite dry to begin with.
You think?
This was an issue that was so explosive, so controversial, so divisive, that the publications, particularly the Alabama Christian Advocate, toned down what they wrote about it. And the same thing was true, really, of the official reports from the conventions. Yeah. There were some important votes, but those are just sort of reported, and you don't know what went on behind the scenes. So from that, I decided if I'm going to really tell the story, I need to talk to some of the actors in the story. And I began very gradually during the time I was teaching semester courses to interview persons. And after I interviewed one person, they would say, well, you need to talk to so-and-so. And so it was kind of like, before long, I was talking to a number of people who really shaped the story that the book became. And I think that their stories were just being told for the first time. To me, in many ways, they had not talked about this for quite some time. And I really had very enthusiastic cooperation from them.
Couple stand out, for example?
A whole bunch stand out. I'll mention two or three. One is John Rutland, who was at Woodlawn Church and was one of the earliest pioneers, I would say, in urging the Alabama Methodists to merge with the Central Conference. And in fact, he himself, in his pastoral duties, invited black people to come to the Woodlawn Church. There was a black choir who sang there. He really delivered sermons on racial justice, which he encapsulated in his famous newsletters. And those newsletters were avidly read by younger ministers. And I think it inspired them. Joe Elmore would be one, and Bob Morgan. They all sort of looked to John Rutland as the father of that part of the pastorate, really.
Didn't Bull Connor walk out of his sermons?
Yes, he did. Bull Connor was a full-fledged member of the Woodlawn Church. He was obviously one of the most prominent members. And he had no use for John Rutland nor his sermons. And when he had heard enough, he would just get up and leave with a great deal of rustling around, I'm sure. But that didn't matter to Rutland. Rutland was quite fearless, and in fact, I think his life was probably in danger a number of times, and he and his wife just did their best to ignore the opposition.
Well, I know you said that he was not alone, but is there any one person that you think perhaps was critical to the ending of the segregated conference system in Alabama?
That would be Bishop Kenneth Goodson. And Harmon and his predecessor had done very little to push the church toward merger. And when Goodson arrived in Alabama, he decided that was one of his most important missions. And Goodson was such an affable person. He was such an incredibly original person. He had come from a very poor background in North Carolina. His father was a railroad engineer. I think there were something like 10 kids or so in the family. He had grown up in a kind of Methodist evangelistic tradition. His sermons were that way. He adored meeting people. So even before he started his work on behalf of the merger, he was well liked and known in Alabama. He made it his business to go out to every nook and cranny, and he particularly enjoyed the after church suppers on the lawn, where it was always a good story that Goodson, who was not a small person, always ate his dessert first.
And then the fried chicken.
And then the fried chicken, yeah. But with his personality, he was able to get the hardcore segregationists to talk to him. And I'm not sure how many minds he changed in that quarter, but I do know he influenced a lot of people who were middle of the road and inspired them to become much more aware that segregation in the church was not exactly what the message of the New Testament was.
The final vote for merger was pretty close.
Yes, one vote. And Goodson had
out of several hundred.
Yeah, and Bob Morgan, who was one of his lieutenants in the cabinet, told Bob, he said, "Bob, go back and recount that. This is too close for me." And when he came back, he said, "Well, Bishop, it's still one vote." And he said, "You know, that doesn't matter. One vote can mean a lot. Can mean a lot." And I guess the conclusion of my book sort of was that one person can mean a lot, can change a lot, because without Goodson, I don't think this would have occurred, and it wouldn't have occurred with anybody who was certainly hardline segregationist or status quo. It would not have occurred with someone who was pushing too hard against the Methodist establishment.
Or someone who was on the fence.
That's right.
Well, we launched this book at conference and sold the goodle of them, but where can people get it now?
There are two websites. I would encourage you to go to the Cokesbury website and Amazon.com. There are some wonderful, wonderful stories in this book that sometimes have to do with the subject and sometimes are maybe off the subject. But this was a very important issue, and you'll see just how dynamic the leadership of the Methodist North Alabama Conference was during this time.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.